No, this isn't about Street Fighter. I want to talk about card games, because I love card games. I love this card, this card, this card, and many of you already know I love this little guy. And because there's a lot to talk about, I'm just going to focus on a few things. Deck size, card draw, or card advantage, resources, and starting hands. Things that impact how fast you can go through your deck, and in turn, the invisible restrictions when it comes to deck building. For all the similarities that the big three card games, Magic, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh! Have in common, they all have different deck building philosophies. And this isn't just going to be about math, I promise this will be interesting. First up is the granddaddy, Magic the Gathering. Constructed decks have to be a minimum of 60 cards, with the only maximum limit being you need to be able to reasonably shuffle it. You can also have a sideboard of up to 15 cards. These cards don't start in your deck, but in best of 3 or 5 games, you can swap out cards from your deck with cards from the sideboard in between games. A deck can only run 4 copies of the same card unless it's a basic land or a card that specifically states otherwise. Like these rats. Almost done, just need to get through a few more rules. On game start, each player draws 7 cards, then comes the mulligan phase. If they choose to, a player can keep their 7-card hand and start the game, but they can also shuffle their hand back and draw a fresh 7. If they choose to keep this one, then they have to put one back on the bottom of the library. The more times you do this, the more cards you have to put back. Once the game begins, it's a card game, so it's turn-based. The player going first doesn't get to draw on their first turn, and the player going second does. There are 2 important factors that impact how you put a Magic deck together. The first one is that Magic is a resource-based game. In order to be able to play most of your cards, or spells, you need mana. And to get mana, you need to play lands. And in order to have lands to play, you have to put lands in your deck. Despite the fact that you're advertised to have 60 cards to build with, about a third of your deck are lands, cards that you have to play, most of the time, just to play your other cards. Card draw in Magic isn't the greatest, but it's not that big a deal because of the relatively slow pace of the game. It isn't too uncommon to see 2 players playing a land and passing on each of their turn once. Even if card draw isn't great, the pace of the game, at least in Standard, is slow enough that the 1 card per turn is enough. This makes the gameplay of Magic more drawn out, with incremental advantage adding up over time instead of fast swing turns. You may be able to build up great advantage on a single turn, but due to the reliance on resources, along with your opponent's ability to directly interact with your plays, remove or counter Magic, the games are a bit grindier. Sure, there can be explosive turns, but generally games aren't decided by the actions of just one early turn. So the mulligan ends up being a big point of skill in Magic. Unless you're playing Modern and have access to the One Ring, you need those cards from your opening hand. But if the hand is unplayable, you have to ship it back. The risk-reward with "can I keep this hand" is complex and a subtle example of skill expression. And because you don't get access to as many cards, you want to keep your deck as consistent as possible. So even though there isn't a hard deck size limit, most of the time players do their best to run 60. To add to the consistency, they want to run as many copies of important cards as possible, which is why you'll see a lot of 4-ofs in lists. In a genre built upon a foundation of variance, players do their best to reduce it as much as they can. Speaking of more ways to reduce variance, Magic gives you access to a sideboard. Sometimes, players may need a card for a specific matchup, but they don't want to sacrifice consistency. Here comes the sideboard. For cards that are subpar in most matchups but incredible in others, you can keep it in your sideboard. Then after game 1, you can swap it into your main deck and take advantage. Sideboard cards let you tech against other decks without sacrificing consistency, while keeping the skill expression of deck building. So that's enough about Magic. It's the game I'm least familiar with, so I didn't go too in depth, and I'm more using it as a baseline. Next up is the Pokemon trading card game. Unlike Magic, Pokemon decks have to be 60 cards. No fewer, no greater. And there's no sideboard. And no mulligan. Well, you have to mulligan if you don't have a basic Pokemon you can play, and instead of taxing your hand, your opponent gets a draw for each time you have to mulligan. Both players start with a starting hand of 7, but the player going first still gets a draw, but they can't attack nor play a supporter card on their first turn. More on that later. So let's go into comparing. Pokemon cards don't cost mana to play, but Pokemon need energy to use their attacks, the way most decks win. And because of that, not only are energy not as important as lands, you don't have to run as many. Now it does vary from deck to deck, but you only really have to run around 9 to 12 energy in your deck, meaning you have more room for playable impact cards, cards that generate advantage and card advantage. Now you may be thinking, you need energy, don't you? How are you going to guarantee to draw it if you only run so few? Pace of the game is different from Magic. Instead of playing a couple of cards per turn, Pokemon is more about digging as hard as you can per turn and trying to get your game plan online as fast as possible. 9 to 12 cards are energy, but half the deck are trainer cards, which can be translated to gas. Mostly. That means card draw, searching your deck, and enablers. These two games may both be 60 card deck formats, but you may end a Pokemon game with only 5 cards left in both decks. The card draw is immense, and the game is built around it. Games end up lasting a few turns, as players each take their individual turns racing to get their attackers online. A key part of the game speed is the card type I mentioned earlier, the supporter card, a subset of trainers. You can only play one of these a turn, but in return they're incredibly powerful. A staple example is Professor's Research, which discards your hand and lets you draw 7. An effect in Magic that costs at least 3 mana, meaning it takes on average until turn 3 to cast, and is either symmetrical, your opponent also gets to take advantage of the effect, or comes with additional downside. The point is, card draw is really good in Pokemon. So how does this affect deck building? Because consistency is not as much a problem, even with you losing access to a tenth of your deck at the start of the game, it's not as necessary to run maximum copies of all your vital cards, which is why you sometimes don't see players maxing out on Pokemon they build their deck around. Some Pokemon is inherently more consistent, but I brought up how you can't bring a sideboard. This actually ends up mattering a whole lot. You don't have an optional sideboard to tech against other decks, so you're forced to run these options in your main deck. And here's the problem. In most card games, you want to try to run as few cards as possible. But Pokemon forces you into running 60. That means you can't go over it, even when you want to. You end up cutting cards that you would like to run, but you just can't because you'd go over the 60 card limit. While the same is true for building against the meta with a sideboard, if you don't have a sideboard, you better make your decisions wisely because it'll cost you. Sideboard decisions only affect you from game 2 onwards in Magic, whereas in Pokemon, you're stuck with the consequences of your actions for every game. But even with this, getting through a deck in Pokemon is still much more consistent, so the challenge in deck building becomes, how do you maintain enough answers, the correct answers for the meta, while keeping your deck consistent enough to run smoothly? Importantly, in Pokemon, your turn means it's your turn. Your opponent can't do anything until their turn. Unlike in the other two games where there are specific cards designed to be played on your opponent's turn. I'm not saying that disruption doesn't exist in Pokemon. The gusting effect of boss's orders has been a mainstay for many years, and the hand disruption of N, Marnie, and Iono have allowed for comebacks to be possible. The point is, disruption or interaction isn't mandatory to be in decks. Many decks do build their entire strategy around locking your opponent, but other than a boss's order or two to help out your offensive pressure, you're not forced to put these cards in your deck. Combining the game speed with the lack of direct interaction, Pokemon games play out a bit like races, where players try to fill their decks with not only a good deal of consistency, but with enough gas to outpace your opponent. Despite Magic and Pokemon both being resource-based games, the difference between the resources makes Pokemon play substantially faster. You're not limited by the once-a-turn restriction, and the cards you do play once a turn are incredibly impactful, not just necessities in order to play your cards. And so the playstyle and deck building between the two differ. Instead of cards that build up incremental value and taking turns just to refuel your hand, Pokemon players try to speed their way to the finish line. Magic decks will put in cards that are specifically for the mid to late game, while cards in Pokemon that don't do anything until turn 3 are already too slow. Granted, aggro decks exist in Magic and control decks exist in Pokemon, but I'm more so talking about the average deck speed. Finally, Yu-Gi-Oh! The sideboard is back, but that's about the only thing that remains familiar. Deck size is now anything from 40 to 60, the minimum significantly lower than the previous examples. Instead of starting with 7 cards, both start with 5, and there are no mulligans at all. The 5 cards you start with are what you get. Much like in Magic, the first player can't draw for turn on their first turn, and much like Pokemon, the first player can't attack on their first turn either. Not only are both players allowed a side deck, they're also allowed a 15 card extra deck. only certain types of cards can go into the extra deck, but players have constant access to these 15 throughout the game. The previous two examples were games with inherent resources. In order to cast a spell, you needed to pay mana, and in order to attack, you needed to have energy attached. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is different in this way. There are no resources. You're limited to one draw and one normal summon per turn, but in the traditional sense, you don't need to pay for your cards, which is why Pot of Greed is so good. Free card advantage for the closest thing to no cost. Starting off, talking about card draw. Card draw is ridiculous, mostly because of how much advantage each individual card can provide. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very fast. If I had to give an example, probably somewhere between the speed of the legacy and vintage formats of Magic. Games don't end up lasting many turns. Part of that reason is due to the extra deck. Remember when I said you always have access to it? This gives players an additional 15 card hand that they're always able to play with. As long as you can meet the requirements to bring them out, all of these are essentially free draws. Cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Can be classified into 4 categories: starters, extenders, payoffs, and disruption. Starters and extenders usually search for cards, while payoffs and disruption don't usually generate you inherent card advantage. And for most decks, most of the payoffs are in the extra deck, meaning you don't have to bog down your consistency with them in the main deck. Starters are the cards you want to draw, because they generate advantage and start your combos. Extenders are the cards that starters pull and generally lead to more advantage, payoffs, or both. So, 40 card deck, fast pace, and the 3 copies max is offset by the reduced deck size along with just how good the cards are. The game ends up being ultra fast and ultra consistent. As long as you draw any of your starters, you have the potential to access all the cards you need for your turn. But I mentioned a 4th type of card, Disruption. In a game so fast, it becomes vital to slow your opponent down. But these Disruption cards don't advance your game plan. Here's where the deck building challenge comes in. How do you balance cards that advance your game plan with cards that disrupt your opponents? So with all this, it would make sense to always play a 40 card deck, right? Generally speaking, yes. But it isn't uncommon to see players entering tournaments with decks larger than 40. Because the cards are just so impactful, and because the hit to consistency is so marginal, some players even build decks with a full 60 cards and still find success. Consistency may be everything, but sometimes it may come on its own. Let's go back to comparing. Because of how much better the cards are, and because of the lack of restrictions, Yu-Gi-Oh! Players have a bit more freedom in the size of the decks that they want to play. And more impactful cards means faster games, not shackled by the once per turn restrictions. I mean in the grand sense, most of Yu-Gi-Oh! Card decks is restrictions. Decks aren't just built to push themselves over the finish line like Pokémon, but a balance of speed and disruption. It's similar to Magic in that sense, but it just happens much faster. First turn in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very important. Games can be decided that quickly in terms of turn count, not player action. While this type of back and forth in Magic won't happen until the later turns. Combined with the added inherent consistency of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s extra deck, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is able to keep the consistency of a Pokemon deck while splashing in the disruption that is needed, like Magic. Magic decks are held back by resources, and Pokemon decks are held back by the one player plays per turn system. Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't. I said I would talk about 3, but video's not done yet, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Hearthstone. Hearthstone gives you a 30 card deck, where you can only put in a maximum of 2 copies of a card. Unless they're legendary, then you can only put in 1 copy. Hearthstone follows the Magic system, where cards actually cost mana. But fortunately, you don't need to play lands. Your mana goes up every turn on its own, the player going first starts with 3 cards, while the player going second starts with 4, but the mulligan in this game is really good. Not only can you put cards back, you can individually choose which cards to mulligan. If you have a card you want to keep in your hand, you can mulligan back the other 2 and keep the one you want. This means that while you started off with 3 or 4 cards, you were actually able to see 6 or 8 cards before your first draw. I'll talk more about this game in another video, so I'll just end it here. I think deck building is an aspect of card games that isn't treated with the nuance it deserves. And I think it's interesting to examine the aspects and mechanics of the games that lead players to build the decks the way they do, and the way it impacts general gameplay trends. And I do want to clarify that I'm speaking in the most general of generalities, so there are definitely decks in these games that run opposite to what I talked about. Even still, I think keeping this in mind will help players build better decks. I ended talking about Hearthstone, a 30 card game, but I didn't talk about another 30 card game. One that I consider to be the best card game period. But I'll go into that next time. You'll have to wait and see. Howdy, my other videos are about fighting games, and I would appreciate it if you gave them a look. If they don't interest you, that's alright. More card game videos are coming too. Subscribe!